Well, hi everybody. This is Truth Seeker here, and I have a long ride home from work. I wanted to get back to the topic of shunning. I think that this is not a trivial matter. I plan to do a series on the subject a little bit more formally. Because I think that it's hard to cover all of the elements of shunning, the psychological elements, the damage, the power that shunning exerts in a person's life, not only the person shunned, but the person who's doing the shunning. And there are a lot of aspects to this, and I reviewed a number of them in my previous video, and I think that there's more to warrant additional information, because I think it does have a chance to impact people's lives in ways that you don't even realize. In my previous video, I talked about some of the characteristics of shunning, but I talked more about some of my personal experience and some of the pain, the emotional distress that it causes, and I think that's important, because I think personal experience is how we interact the best, that we certainly can relate, empathize. That's one of the human qualities. I'm sorry about the adjusting here, taking time here when the traffic is stopped. There we go. It makes a little better video. So anyway, one of the things is that I received a comment recently, and I do appreciate my commenters. They generally pretty positive, and they really do have an uplifting effect on me emotionally. It's always nice to hear that people enjoy what you're doing. I know that I don't have that many subscribers. I guess I kind of fall into a strange little niche, and certainly not many Bible students contact me. I did have one that I knew pretty well 30 some years ago. We lived with them at the Dawn. Again, the Dawn is sort of a mini Bethel, and they're volunteer workers, and they put them up with room and board and so on. It's very much like Bethel, except on the micro scale, not thousands of people, but maybe 10 to 30 people. At least in the day that we were at the Dawn, there were 30 or 35 there. Now it's I believe it's almost peopleless. They still exist in name, but I don't think that they have much in the way of real viable workforce anymore. But anyway, one of the commenters that recently commented on one of my videos talked, I guess it was the shun video, and the individual who made the comment, and now this is not a criticism, but I just found it remarkable how predictable it is. I included a clip of Lloyd Evans and his response to an interview he was doing with an individual whose father, when he announced that he was questioning the Jehovah's Witness faith, his father verbally abused him in a shouting match and cornered him, and really came at him with very strong verbal abuse. And and Lloyd's response was classic. I wish that had happened to me. And I read a couple of examples from Kip Williams' book where people who have been shunned would rather be physically or verbally abused than shunned, than ostracized. And that's how emotionally distressing this is, because it fundamentally affects our certain basic human needs, especially for human needs, and one of them is the need to exist, the need to have some kind of a community, your self-esteem, and the idea that this not speaking, no communication, no acknowledgement that you exist, is as if you were dead, and how powerful that is. And that is a very, very, very strong reaction, to wish that somebody beat you up as opposed to shunning you. So that's how powerful it is. And there have been situations where suicides occurred, and I'm certain that it's not a I don't think there's been a study on the subject, but there's been there's no question that there have been suicides and very tragic situations regarding ostracism. Kip Williams gives Columbine as a primary example of two individuals who were ostracized by their peers in high school. They were outcast, and what they did, and the pain that resulted in that, their actions. They retaliated, and with violence and anger, and many people were killed, young people whose lives were still in front of them. And then there was the mother in Michigan, in Ann Arbor, Michigan, who last year killed her two children, her husband, and then herself, because directly as a result of her JW congregation having shunned her. They were disfellowshipped, and her children had completed college, and they were looking forward to a life, and they hadn't lived life yet, and she took their lives. I mean, Lauren was her name, and she was a 46-year-old mother, had been a successful model, and she had grown up in the Jehovah's Witnesses, and the shunning was beyond anything that she could live with, and she snapped. And I believe my brother's suicide, now that I understand a little bit more of the extreme elements of shunning and what it can do to a person, I believe that his psychological state was spurred on by what he knew was the rejection and the lack of acceptance on the part of the Bible students of his life and his actions. I mean, the week before he passed away, my brother was telling me that he believed that he deserved second death, that God, he was alienated from God, and that he was sure he was going to second death, which is the Bible student's analog to the Christian hell. I'm not going to go into too much detail about it, but it was part of the fundamental belief of the Bible students that that if you were not deserving of a resurrection in the kingdom, that that God would not resurrect you, and you would cease to exist forever. And it's interesting that people would, for years and years, I found it more acceptable, the concept of hell more acceptable than second death or non-existence. And the reason for that is the concept of hell, although I didn't believe in hell, at least the concept of hell I found more merciful, in the sense that in the idea of hell, there's consciousness, and the human spirit is such that if one is in existence, and you assume that if you're conscious, you exist, hope springs eternal. That maybe, despite what you've been taught about the eternal punishment of burning and torture in hell, that the human spirit is such that maybe God might have mercy. There's always that in the back of your mind, and you always, if there's hope, it's a better situation when it's hopeless, and non-existence is hopeless. There is no hope. And that's one of the things that I didn't really understand it myself, except implicitly, that the second death concept was even more, let's say, emotionally powerful, more distressing, a more horrible prospect than the prospect of a hell, in which, at least if you're conscious, you do have some sense of hope. Humans rarely lose all hope. And so that was something that I never really understood, but it is something that's implicit to the idea of shunning, the concept of shunning. Now, this discussion actually kicked off because of a comment that I received, that an individual commented and said that they were disfellowshipped 35 years ago, and they dealt with it by shunning, reverse shunning, or shunning, and the people who were doing the shunning them back. And that often happens. Now, that is one of the key characteristics of long-term shunning, and we hadn't really discussed that part, that when the initial phases of the impact of shunning settle into the realization that the shunning is not going to stop, that the shunning is going to continue, and it will continue indefinitely, then the anger then settles back into retaliation, and that it's a matter of taking back power, control, and by shunning the person back, they're punishing them in return. So institutional shunning is a form of punishment, and it's understood to be that, and by shunning back is returning like punishment with like punishment. And so it's interesting that comment was made, because it's a classic response to shunning. And it's a terrible thing, because this is how communications completely and permanently break down. In the book, Ostracism, The Power of Silence, Kip Thorne. I keep saying Kip Thorne. Kip Thorne is the famous astrophysicist. Kip Williams, who is the first to really study the psychology of shunning, he found that he relayed a circumstance or an incident in which a husband and wife were married for a long time, and the husband inexplicably stopped speaking to the wife, and after a while it became, she didn't understand why. She didn't know. He wouldn't tell her. No matter what she did, she was frustrated to the point where it just about drove her crazy. And so she decided, when the realization settled in that he wasn't going to quit this shunning, that she stopped speaking to him. And this was a situation that lasted for 45 years in their marriage. Rather than divorce, they lived with this situation and punished each other in ultimate torture for 45 years. And this, you wonder, how could this be? How could such treatment go on for such a long period? But these are the consequences of shunning. And while the Watchtower may have formally adopted shunning as a deterrent, let's say proactive deterrent to prevent, discourage, to stop or plug the hemorrhage of Jehovah's Witnesses leaving the religion. This was shortly after the 1975 debacle with their last prediction of when the kingdom would begin, and Armageddon would begin, failed miserably. There was a pretty sharp decline in the membership. It was a period in which the growth went negative for several years, and then they had the coup that took place afterwards, with the governing body taking over, the president, the role of the presidency in the Watchtower taking a back seat and being made a figurehead in the Watchtower, and the governing body really assuming the role of power in the Jehovah's Witnesses, and they consolidated that by the formation of the Christian Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses as a separate corporation, and we can go on with that. But they formalized shunning to deal with a dissent that took place with Raymond Franz on some of the policies and beliefs, teachings of the Watchtower, and they took a very, very strong and harsh retaliatory action against Ray Franz and disfellowshipped him, and began a policy around 1981 of shunning and disfellowshipping individuals who dissent the teachings of the governing body. Disfellowshipping as a practice was officially condoned in 1952, although it wasn't a policy that was utilized as much as since 1981, when it was adopted officially as a weaponize families and family ties. Disfellowshipping was instituted in 1952, whereas in 1947 everybody does point to that famous consolation article where are you to disfellowshipped or excommunicated? That's the title of the article. Are you to excommunicated? Where the Watchtower writers, that would have been Fred Franz or Knorr at that time, Nathan Knorr, under his presidency, his leadership, where they actually criticize the practice of excommunication, which was first introduced by the Catholic Church. They practiced excommunication. My great grandfather's second wife, I guess you would call her a step great grandmother. She was devoutly Catholic. My grandfather married her. My great grandfather married her because his wife died of tuberculosis. He had 4 sons. My grandfather was 12 at the time his mother passed away. And although she was an actress with a good career in New York on the stage, she gave up her practice and married my great-grandfather and took care of these 4 young boys. But my great-grandfather was Protestant, and the church did not condone marrying into Protestantism. They were Presbyterian in name only. My great-grandfather never was a very religious man. He lived more of a secular life. He was Presbyterian by name only, really. But nonetheless, my great-grandmother, my step-great-grandmother, was excommunicated by the Catholic Church. And she was a devout Catholic, and she never stopped going to church. They wouldn't permit her to take Mass. That was her punishment. Yeah, they were still doing that in the early 1900s. The world has changed quite a bit in the way of excommunication. But the Watchtower did practice shunning. It was a part of their operations. Judge Rutherford utilized it. Many Bible students, including my own grandfather, my paternal grandfather, relayed stories readily back to when there was a division between men, those that were loyal to Russell and did not accept the doctrinal changes that Rutherford was introducing into the teachings of the Watchtower, and he would disfellowship them, and or they would leave. And those that were loyal to Watchtower were directly instructed by Rutherford not to have anything to do with any of those that remain loyal to Russell. And so that there was a pretty large division. If you look at if you go to JW Facts, you can see the numbers for yourself. There is, in some of the historical statistical information, data on the number of individuals who attended Memorial from around 1917 through 1927, about a 10-year period, maybe a little less than 10 years, but the numbers peaked as 1925, just like 1975. The numbers peaked sharply in a relatively short period, although the magnitude of the numbers of individuals associated with Watchtower back in the 1920s were in the thousands, not in the millions. But the number of individuals associated with Watchtower, who were Bible students, consecrated, baptized Bible students, were somewhat in the area of maybe, I don't know, 50,000 or so by the time Charles Russell passed away. It peaked in 1926 and 7 to 89 or 90,000 individuals, and then in 1928 it plummeted to 17,000. Now, something extraordinary happened at that time, and I also looked at I did a video on some other study I did with the Pilgrim speakers list in the yearbooks began in 1927, and they always recount the previous year's work, and so 1927 covered 1926 and so on. And when you look at that period of time in 1928, 1929, you look at the speakers list, the Pilgrim speakers list. Later on, it was called an ordained ministers, but at the time they still retained some of the old Bible student terminology, and they were called Pilgrim speakers, and there were about 260 such speakers named in the 1928 yearbook. And then in 1929, if you count the number of names, there were about 240. But when you compare the names, you realize that a lot of the names, almost 50% turnover, were no longer, from 1928 to 1929, almost 40, I think it was about 47% of the names were gone from the original list from 1928, and a whole new group of names replaced them. And so while there was only a drop of about 30 speakers in total, going from 260 to about 230 or so, I'm not real exact with these numbers, I'd have to refresh myself, but the actual turnover in the names themselves was closer to 50%, and so that shows that something dramatic happened pretty much in that year. That reflects again something that was that those memorial numbers indicated a drop from 89,000 in 1927 to 17,000 in 1928, and that's about a 75% drop. That's a huge decline. And again, the Bible students then regrouped in the early 1930s under various organizations. The larger group was ended up being the Dawn Bible students under Norman Woodworth. Well, not under him. He never really was, but he was sort of the facilitator, the catalyst that initiated the Dawn Bible students, and he was the managing editor of the Dawn, and the key writer. He was the Russell of the Dawn Bible students, and he was a strict Russellite. He republished the studies in the scriptures and all of the booklets that he wrote and the articles in the Dawn magazine that he wrote all reflected basically Russell's theology, and so they were basically Russellites but they retained the name Bible Students. And eventually the Watchtower adopted the name Jehovah's Witnesses in 1931. The Dawn Bible Students came into existence in 1932. So, a little bit of a history lesson, but the Rutherford had deemed the Bible students, and he had actually addressed them in the 1932 yearbook when he justified the adoption of the name Jehovah's Witnesses. He acknowledges the existence of the various Bible student sects, and he had instructed Jehovah's Witnesses. He called them the Bible students that left and dissociated themselves from the Watchtower, the evil servant. And Jehovah's Witnesses were to have nothing to do with the evil servant or evil slaves. And so there was an ostracism. That I had many stories of individuals who, when the Dawn was first established, it was located in Brooklyn, very close to the Watchtower. Sorry about the it's not a very good picture image, but anyway, they were very closely situated physically to one another, the Dawn and the Watchtower, and there would be encounters of Bible students working for the Dawn with former colleagues of theirs from the Bethel days. And brethren, they used to meet together at the temple at Bethel, and they wouldn't speak to one another because of the hard feelings and the fact that Judge Rutherford had so much control and power over the Bethel family that they weren't allowed to speak. And this extended, this had a trickle-down effect throughout the movement. And so as Jehovah's Witnesses grew, the ostracism of Bible students went along with it through the 1930s. And you can see the situation verified by Olin Moyle, that circumstance and how Rutherford treated him, had Moyle thrown out of his own ecclesia in Wisconsin after he left, where basically he and his wife were tossed out of the Bethel by Rutherford. They hadn't left the faith. They went back home to Wisconsin, where Moyle practiced, originally had a practice, and they started meeting again with their congregation, and they were disfellowshipped by Rutherford, and so the congregation had to excise them from their meetings, and so Moyle was given the heave-ho. But on top of that, I think culturally, this whole idea of ostracism was a sort of a heritage of the Bible students, even from the earliest days of the Bible students. And I think the most notable individual was Mariah Russell. When you look and research a little of Mariah's life, and I always found her to be an intriguing individual, an interesting figure in the Bible student history, because first off, she was married to Charles Taze Russell, the founder, and she was an integral part of the Watchtower's formation. She was the treasurer, she was a director, she wrote frequently for the Watchtower. She had much more of an education than Charles did. Charles only having a 7th grade education. She was a school teacher, and so she was more educated than Charles, and had better writing skills. She was very strong initially in promoting the idea that Russell was the Laodicean messenger, that he was the wise and faithful servant, or in today's Jehovah's Witness nomenclature, the faithful and discreet slave. But anyway, the story, it's no secret among those who know anything about the relationship of Mariah and Charles, that their marriage fell apart. First off, it was celibate. Second, Russell, as the movement began to grow and he began to have more influence in the Bible students, the elders they took exception of a woman having much say in the running of the organization. Now, Mariah's sister, I understand, she married Russell's father, which is kind of strange. And I made a video about this situation and some of the interesting things that I found on Ancestry regarding their living arrangements in the early 1880s. She was very strongly a suffragette and had influence over Mariah in that regard. And so Russell criticized Mariah for being poisoned with the suffragette movement, and that women should accept their secondary role, that they shouldn't have any rights. And to this day, Bible students' culture, not too different from Jehovah's Witnesses, where women don't have much in the way of any ability to have authority or teach. They have to wear head coverings. They don't do so because it's a rule established by a governing body or a central ruling party, but it's part of the culture. And so if you don't wear one, you're as a sister, you're considered rebellious, somewhat of a troublemaker, because why won't you conform to our cultural values? And so you place yourself into this place of criticism. So Bible students use ostracism to leverage, to manipulate individuals into performing what behavior is expected culturally as a Bible student. For example, the head coverings, and that sisters should wear dresses during Sunday meeting, and that slacks are not as well, there is always the renegade, but again, you're not considered more of the ideal behavior for a sister would be to wear a dress, and a modest dress, and wear your hair modestly, and so on. It's interesting. Now, Russell himself used ostracism and coercion, because coercion and ostracism go together very strongly. They correlate very, very strongly with the vow. Now, I don't know how many Jehovah's Witnesses are aware of the vow, but that was a big issue after Russell's divorce. There was some criticism regarding some of the things, allegations and rumors that had been passing around about Russell, and so he adopted this vow that the Bethel family had to take. Apparently, Bethel still has similar requirements written down as rules for individuals at the Bethel to accept in regards to certain behaviors, especially towards the opposite sex. And this was established during Russell's day, and leaving the door wide open if you're in the room of a person of the opposite sex, and a number of things. The occult, staying away from the occult. And it wasn't it was really dealt with two things. The vow dealt with relationships between opposite sex, what was considered to be appropriate and inappropriate, with certain exceptions, such as a mother and son can be in a room with the door closed, but if it's any other man and woman, the door should be wide open, public. And Russell really pushed this vow onto the Bible Students movement, and he did so. He started first with the Bethel family, and then he published it and expected the movement to adopt this vow more widely, and he began publishing names. And many Bible students took exception to this because they thought of this as being coercion. There were elders that were punished by not being elected for not adopting the vow. And Russell's written excuse was, well, what's wrong with the vow? It's only right. And why would you not sign it? Why would you not publicly announce that you've adopted the vow? And what are you hiding? He was using coercion, and Bible students were being punished by the movement at large if they did not accept the vow. In fact, the vow was still controversial among Bible students even up into the 1980s and later at conventions like the Bible Students General Convention. Should it be read? Should it not be read? And it was left up to the decision of the day's chairman. And so there were the issue was never resolved amongst brethren, but the Bible students still argued that point up until relatively within my lifetime. Remember that being an issue. Now, when Russell, around I think it was about 1907, Russell came out with an article called The Three Great Covenants, where he clarified his position on the covenants, what he called the Abrahamic covenant, the law covenant or Hagar covenant. The Abrahamic covenant was represented by Sarah. This is all out of Galatians. I think it's around the 3rd chapter. Sarah, the wife of Abraham, represented the Abrahamic covenant as Russell taught it. Hagar represented the law covenant, and this is all explained by Paul. And then by inference, Keturah, the last wife of Abraham, after Sarah died, Abraham took a wife, Hagar. Now Keturah. Now Hagar was the handmaiden or slave of Sarah. And so Ishmael was born from Hagar because Sarah couldn't conceive. She had said, well, if I can't conceive the promised seed, then I'll give you my handmaiden slave, Hagar, and you can foster a child, Abraham, with her, and I'll consider that my son as fulfilling the promise that God made, that in thee and thy seed shall all nations be blessed. And so Ishmael was born in that manner, but God didn't accept it, according to the story in Genesis, that he did not accept that arrangement, and Sarah, well beyond her years of childbearing, I think she was 75 and Abraham was 100, she bore Isaac. And we all know the story that Isaac, when he grew up, he was taken by Abraham out to be slaughtered as a sacrifice, and ram was offered as a substitute and all that. And Bible students make a big deal about that type, and it's because of this article that Russell published, and I think it was around 1907 or in that period there. And so Keturah represented the new covenant, according to Russell. So you had the Abrahamic covenant, the law covenant, and the new covenant, which was the kingdom, and Keturah represented that new law covenant that was to be established during the 1,000 years. Well, that was a big departure from what Russell had taught for the first at least 30 years of his ministry, and many Bible students were disrupted by this change, this major doctrinal change. And Russell dealt with it pretty severely, that those who did not accept this doctrinal change, they would be disfellowshipped from the brethren, from the body of the brethren. And that's how the New Covenant Bible Students group started, particularly in Melbourne, Australia. Ernest Hennings was the branch head in Melbourne, Australia, at the time of this change, and he did not adopt Russell's teachings on the matter, and so he was disfellowshipped, he and his wife. Now his wife was Rose Ball, née Ball, the infamous Rose Ball that was the central figure in the divorce proceedings between Mariah and Charles Russell. And Rose was supposedly a foster child that they adopted. There's some question as to how much of a child she really was. Apparently she was 16 at least when she came to live with the Russells. But she came to live with them in their home, and she stayed with them for a while, and apparently something developed between her and Charles Russell that was something that objectionable to Mariah. But Mariah was somewhat of a confused person. I mean, she pressed these matters in court, but not all the way. She didn't use infidelity as the cause of the discord between her and Charles. More of an irreconcilable differences and cruelty on the part of Charles were more of the allegations. But she also mentioned that there was a thing going on between Russell and Rose Ball. She found him in Rose's room on some occasions. There were other things, and I'm not going into this matter. There's some, controversy over to what extent Russell may or may not have had, it was untrue to Mariah, but nonetheless, she was Rose Ball was a figure involved in that divorce, and she was married to Ernest Hennings in the 1890s and went to Australia to live with him when he became the branch manager there. And she was disfellowshipped along with Ernest by Russell for not adopting the changes in the covenant's teachings. Now that was pretty harsh, and it formed a whole new movement that wouldn't have any association with the Bible students. They were the New Covenant Bible students, and when I was growing up, you didn't speak to or associate with the New Covenant Bible students. They were out of the truth. And so there was that as an example of that being part of the Bible student culture, the vow, the way they dealt with the vow, the way they dealt with, or Russell in particular, dealt with the change in the covenant's teaching. And then there was Russell's personal life with Mariah. Now, I implied, or not implied, but I referred to the discord in their marital situation, and it degraded pretty severely in the first I think decade or 13 years. Their marriage was at least tenable for them. I wouldn't have called it an ideal marriage by any means, but apparently they weren't fighting, let's put it that way. But things got to the point where they ostracized one another. They lived under the same roof, and they weren't speaking to one another. They communicated with each other, and this is Russell doing this to Mariah, and Mariah retaliating back with the silent treatment in their own personal relationship. They communicated only by notes. They would not speak to one another, even though they lived under the same roof. And they used Rose as the go-between. If they wanted to say something, relatively mundane that pertained to something that was in their daily life, they would write a note, one to the other, and they'd give Rose the note to give to the other. This situation occurred until the day that Russell and Mariah actually separated. And the story about the separation was none too pleasant. I understand that around 1897, when the Watchtower was located in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, they called it the Bible House. Russell had his own home, and Mariah was living in that home on her own, I think, for several years. And then Russell demanded that she leave and threw her out. Apparently took her possessions and and tossed her physically, literally tossed them out of the house, and she had no money. She had to go live with her sister Emma, and Emma again was the wife of Russell's father, Joseph Lytle Russell, and so Mariah moved in with her sister Emma. Eventually, when you look at the census records, they were living together with their mother, Ackley, and there were the three of them that lived together. Russell's father, Joseph, died in 1897, and so it was about that time when Joseph Russell died, when Mariah ended up moving in with Emma. Now, there was a will. Emma had a little money. Mariah had nothing. I mean, when they separated, Russell had no intent of paying any alimony, and she needed some support. She had no means of supporting herself, and women had a very difficult time in those days. So Mariah ended up suing for divorce and for alimony. And a lot of people say, this wasn't a true divorce; it was more of a separation. They call it a divorce of bed and board, but it was a true divorce, and they were no longer considered really husband and wife. So Russell himself engaged in ostracism in the most personal of his relationships. And so this practice trickled down. I mean, it's no wonder that it being so entrenched in the history of the Watchtower that it's part of the culture, and that it became more and more entrenched and infused within the culture and the values of the society, and the Jehovah's Witness religion in particular. But it's part of the Bible students too. I mean, just not in a formal sense, but the Bible students do disfellowship. I've had family members disfellowshipped by the Bible students, extended family, and in-laws that were family members through my marriage. So they were all disfellowshipped formally, and so it occurs, it happens, and it's something that is not foreign to the Bible student culture. So anyway, I noticed that the time has gone on, and again, this kind of turned into a sort of a bit of a Bible student Watchtower history lesson, but it does talk about some of the culture of the movement, and some of its why some of these things may be a part of that culture. And it goes back. It goes way back. I mean, adopted by the very founder of the religion itself. Practiced it again, like I said, in the most personal aspects of his life, and more generally with those he called brethren. I mean, if you read the book Laodicean Messenger, and I think this may be the last point that I made. There's a story related in that book. That's an over-the-top book that is just bizarre. It really is bizarre. It was published by the Chicago Bible Students Press in 1923. It was written, I believe, from, I forget the fellow's name now. Wisdom, was it? Anyway, this individual had a close relationship with Russell. The authors doesn't provide his name in the book, but it's an over-the-top tribute to and biography of Charles Russell and all of the magical miracles that he performed, greater works than the Apostle Paul himself. And there's one story there that always, it really kind of gets under my skin a little bit, about when Russell had been away from the U.S. In Europe on a special trip to address, I guess, the growth of the Bible student movement in Europe, speak and meet and talk with the Bible students there, and he was away from Bethel for a number of months. And when he came back from Europe, he went right to inspecting the Bethel home and making sure that it was being run in accordance with his wishes. It was like a drill sergeant doing a barracks inspection to make sure that the corners on the beds were made right, and that a quarter would bounce off the cot. So anyway, this was something that Russell did to keep the individuals on guard, and he went down to inspect the stores, the provisions, the food provisions for the family, and I guess it was in the basement of the Bethel home they had, and the individual that was responsible for keeping the provisions, he was directed to go down and show the provisions to Russell, and there was a big stockpile apparently of potatoes, and Russell asked, I'm sure he quipped it, how much did you pay for these? He didn't, it was just a short, I can imagine it was a kind of quipped, put the poor brother on the spot. How much did you pay for these? And the brother told him what he paid for them, I guess per pound or whatever. And Russell's only comment was, "You paid too much." Well, when the Laodicean messenger, God's messenger, tells you, criticizes you, you paid too much. You're not doing your job. You're not watching the Lord's money properly. Holy cow, that poor brother must have, he must have felt awful inside, and that was the end of the matter. Now, the book praised Russell in this incident, and Russell, they said, oh, how remarkable this man was, that he had been away so long, but that such a minor detail as the price of potatoes never escaped he was omniscient. That's really what it comes down to. That Russell was omniscient, and that he knew the price of, even though he was gone in Europe, he knew the price of potatoes when he came back, and that the poor brother was who was grilled on the matter had paid too much. Well, Russell didn't know that Russell was making a deliberate attack on this poor brother to just to make him feel bad, to put him on the spot, to make him feel, inferior to Russell's authority. And I always thought that was an awful reflection of Russell. I thought it was very insightful as to what kind of a man he was. Again, like I've mentioned in previous videos, there was the meeting dad, the Bible student, great guy that my father was, and the home dad, who was very angry, violent, and really had nothing much to do with us boys, except when he was angry and we got in his way or did something that he didn't like. Then we got a pretty bad walloping. But outside of that, my dad wasn't really involved with us boys. Didn't really find us as, spending time with us as a matter of importance. And that became worse as we grew into our teens. And so this potato incident made me realize that this was the real Russell we were looking at. And this was a rare glimpse, even though he was glorified in this matter, his omniscient knowledge of the price of potatoes. It showed me what kind of man Russell really was, and how awful it must have been for Mariah to be married to this man, and how their relationship could have digressed and disintegrated to the point where they were writing notes to one another. And this was a situation that lasted for years in their home. It wasn't just a temporary deal. This was a matter of ostracism, and to its fullest extent. And no wonder it's a part of the culture of the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Watchtower Society. So when one talks about, the introduction of shunning and ostracism historically in the Watchtower, it goes back to its founder from a cultural and power value point of view. But anyway, we'll get into some of the more formal analysis of this. I'm these were just a number of things that came to mind. I had a long ride, and I thought, maybe some of this might be beneficial for those. I think it's a key thing for us to understand these practices and these methods, these mechanisms that are used, psychological warfare that is used by these organizations, by all religions, really. Because it's not just a practice of Watchtower and the Mormons and the Scientologists and the Seventh-day Adventists and other groups that have shunning as a part of their religion's epistemology, I guess, if you want to call it that. The thing is that it can happen on the personal level in any religion. Again, I mentioned earlier in my other video, Seth Andrews, whose family relations have disintegrated to the very barest minimum, and he's sort of he was from a mainstream evangelical family. There are 100 million of them in this country, and his rejection of his faith, his parents, used psychological warfare against him. The fact that they can't communicate except for the barest minimum has caused a tremendous rift in his life, and he's talked about it on numerous occasions. And I'm sure this is the situation with many individuals in religion. And Kip Williams, when I reached out to him, I did write an email, and I'm sorry, I see this thing is going on, but these are important points, because here's a hypothetical situation. Now think, what if Watchtower suddenly saw the light and said shunning is immoral? We're abolishing shunning. Okay, everybody can talk to one another now. Now what kind of situation would that engender? Here, individuals have been shunned for no good reason, to be punished by close family members, parents, children, children being shunned by their parents, and siblings shunning, and so on. Whole families breaking apart. What if that practice was rescinded, and now a parent reaches out to a child that they've shunned for years and years, expecting that relationships can return to normal? They can't. I mean, they shunned for no good reason. How is that person, let's say it's a child that had been shunned for the rejection of the faith, and shunned by a parent, and now suddenly the parent is reaching out and saying, I want to see you, I want to see my grandchildren, or whatever, I want to establish normal relationships again. How can that be? I mean, they were complicit in the shunning, and are they sorry? Well, no, they're not sorry. They were obeying orders. They did what they were told to do. And so how can any reconciliation and reparation be made? And I found this a very difficult thing, because I think that if Watchtower did something like this, you'd have cognitive dissonance up the wazoo with that one. And I think there might be quite a number of individuals who would end up making their way back into the trap of the Jehovah's Witnesses again, because they now want to reestablish their connection and relationship to their parents, and the only way to do so is to accept and concede to the parents' wishes to reconnect. And so I think that Watchtower could actually create a tremendous amount of turmoil if they did so. And I really questioned this, and I wrote to Kip Williams about this question, and he had kind of an interesting answer. He said, of course, reconciliation is quite, in relationships between family members, is always desirable, but this could be a really interesting or a really tough situation, just because there isn't a concession on the part of the shunner. that they've done anything wrong. And so it leaves the shunned in that powerless position of having to accept what the parent had done to them or the shunner had done to them without any expectation of remorse that it ever happened, because it was fully justified in the shunner's mind. And so what great dissonance would there be if suddenly shunning were removed, because on one hand the shunned wants to reestablish the relationship, but also acknowledge that they were not the ones in the wrong, that they were right, and that will never happen. That acknowledgement would never happen. And Williams wrote back to me saying that this is something that he had not considered, that it is something that would be of import in a study. He doesn't know of any such circumstance. So while reconciliation between shunned, or let's say formerly estranged family members through shunning, it's not necessarily a good thing that shunning suddenly be removed and family members brought back together to reestablish normal relationships, because the person who was shunned is left with a void, with the sense that they really didn't have the value, and that they really were they really did deserve the treatment. They're going to have to accept that as a condition of reestablishing the relationship. So it's not such a simple thing to say that shunning should just end. The shunning should end with the acknowledgement that it was wrong, it was immoral, and that it was abuse and mistreatment of the people who were shunned, so that there's a validation for those who were shunned, and then that can begin the reestablishment of relationships between the shunner and the shunned. Of course, that's a hypothetical situation. This is not going to happen. Watchtower is not going to see the light. The 8 or 9 whoever governing body members who now run the show are not intellectually sharp enough to and morally sound enough to see the immorality of shunning, and to recant and rescind, repeal shunning as a practice of their religion. It just won't happen. But to think about that from a hypothetical situation, it would require quite a bit more than just the abolishment of shunning. That in itself would be wrong, and forces the hand of the person shunned to acknowledge and accept something that is demeaning and validates their whole moral sense. So anyway, I know I've talked a long time, and actually I'm almost home. you can see that I have a long commute on occasions. But anyway, I hope this was of interest. I think that this is a relevant subject, and we'll talk more about it. There's a lot to this. When people kill over this, when people commit suicide over this, this is not a trivial matter. This is not a trivial subject by any means. Of course, it's not the most important issue to take against Watchtower. Certainly the child abuse circumstances far overshadow the shunning matter issue. But shunning is not a trivial thing by any means, and is up there. If not second, it's in the top 3 main issues wrong with the Jehovah's Witnesses. So anyway, this is Truth Seeker here. We'll pick up on this subject a little bit more formally in the next video, and I wish you all the very best. So take care, everybody.